So Laurence Dickie, when did loudspeaker designing begin for you?
Really, I was born into audio or reproduced sound. My dad had a tannoy corner unit, a single tannoy corner unit with a 15-inch monitor gold and a quad 222 amplifier. And really from the year dot, I was immersed in reproduced sound. And my dad was a very keen listener to music. In '67, he went to a pair of tannoy Lancasters, still 15-inch monitor golds. All the time, I was aware of how important the loudspeaker part of this system was. And it's really, see, my memory is it was when I was 8 years old that my dad I must have inquired as to how exactly a loudspeaker worked, and he'd given me some rough idea of it being a cone of paper and a bobbin of wire and a magnet, because I put together exactly that. I got a sheet of paper and cut it into a circle and stuck it together into a cone, made a little bobbin of enamel wire, heaven knows where I got that from, stuck it onto the bottom of this cone, and then got a little old Alnico magnet, which I think actually did come from a loudspeaker, stuck the ends of the wire on a battery, and of course it jumped and made a crackling sound, and I was really chuffed to bits. Dad, I made a speaker. Now, okay, it was a bit of a space between that and the first actual speaker, but I was always scavenging. I was always digging out old radios, and the particular driver in question that I remember fondly, and I still have it actually, was in an old radio in the streets of Paris, and I used to pick up stuff and drag it back to our place and take it to bits. Anyway, this speaker driver...
In Paris?
In Paris, yeah.
You lived in Paris?
My grandmother lived there, and my mother was French, and we used to visit there every summer and Christmas. And there wasn't that much to do, frankly, so scavenging and making things out of old radios was one of the things I enjoyed doing most. So I got this driver, possibly, I don't know, 12 centimetre thing, made a cardboard box, stuck this speaker in, and plugged it into a transistor radio, and I have to say, I thought it sounded really good, and it was just inspiring. Really from that point onwards, I thought speakers brilliant. Carry on. And my dad was fully supportive. That's the point.
Now, were you a hobbyist speaker builder before education or work?
They sort of went in tandem. I suppose as I learnt about science, engineering, physics, I gradually started to understand the various parameters of loudspeaker design and started to understand what I was doing wrong. So by the time I was 16, my father very kindly, and I must say I'd been pestering him for absolutely years, but in my bedroom, he had an old Vitavox 12-inch driver, a KT1210, in its original cardboard box, which was very much my dad's style, keep it all in its original packaging. And I'd looked at this cardboard box for years, being really intrigued as to what was inside it. And finally, as I say, when I was 15 or 16, he allowed me to take this thing out. It's a beautiful loudspeaker. I made a cabinet in school in the woodwork lesson, and that was really the first time that was a proper loudspeaker. But the interesting thing is that intuitively, I put a bit of a labyrinth inside this cabinet, which, I don't know why, I don't know what inspired me to, but I had a bit of a thing about putting speakers in the ends of tubes, really, from a very early age, and it was just intuitive. I don't think at the beginning it was founded on any sound science, no pun intended, but of course it works. To me, if you have a good long depth of absorption behind the loudspeaker, then I personally find that it gives a better result. So anyway, yes, when I went to university in '78, this, I suppose, 4 of your cubic feet chipboard box with a Vitavox driver, and by then a KEF tweeter, came with me. Yeah.
So were you thinking to be a speaker designer at that point?
In fact, I had a pretty broad scientific interest. If you go further back, just about the time when I was sticking coils of wire onto paper cones, I was as interested in chemistry, but it was a cousin of mine on these visits I used to, I mentioned earlier when I used to go to France for the summers and Christmases, a cousin of mine who was studying electronic engineering sort of said, electronics is actually a much more interesting thing to do at home because there are a lot more experiments and things, hobbies, projects that you can do at home compared to chemistry, which of course is a little bit more about making smells, bangs, and getting your clothes stained and things. So it was he who sort of nudged me across.
So you graduated from university in which discipline?
Right. And so in my teens, as I say, I started to get into electronics and then building amplifiers, building valve amps. Of course, in those days it was easy to build a valve amp, transistor amp. And then university, of course, is quite brutally theoretical. And around this sort of time, I began to get more and more interested in loudspeakers. I think because of all the different scientific and engineering disciplines that are involved in loudspeakers. You have, of course, electromagnetics for the basic drive of the thing, but then the materials science of the cones, the surrounds, the cabinets, this mechanics, clearly acoustics, and then psychoacoustics, and then even finally aesthetics, because of course the thing about loudspeakers, they tend to be largish, visible objects, and it's just such a wide scope of interest that I think, in the end, it's the most interesting part of the hi-fi chain. And frankly, at the time, certainly, it was the weakest link in the hi-fi chain. So there was so much to do, so much to play for.
And did you go job hunting?
The first thing I did after finishing university was to write to all the UK speaker manufacturers. So KEF, or as the careers advisor said, Band W. Who's Band W? Anyway, so I wrote to all these companies, one or two of the Meridian thing. Actually went for an interview with KEF, who said, well, come along anyway, because we like to have a portfolio of possible applicants. So that was very interesting. Met Laurie Fincham. No such luck with B&W. And then I got just a job to fill the space, actually in electronics, pure electronics, for a games machine manufacturer. But at that time, in fact, at the end of university, I had actually started building speakers for friends and family, and these were all based on KEF drivers, and all the big ones were KEF B139s in transmission lines. I started off with, I think it was the Atkinson magazine design, but bit by bit started to adapt those and make them into my own. So I spent the whole of the summer at the end of university, so it's 81. I turned the house into a workshop. When I think about what my fellow students were extraordinarily accommodating, because I filled the place with sawdust. Yeah, but people were basically paying me for materials costs, but great fun. I really, really enjoyed it. And then I started at this job, as I mentioned, with a games machine manufacturer, but at the same time I was obviously still tinkering with loudspeakers.
This was in the early 80s.
So yeah, that's 82, 83. And I'd come up with, so B129 in a Labyrinth transmission line bass box, and then a little thing which we'd probably call an LS35A derivative, although it was a lot deeper, with a pair of bipolar amplifier modules, and then little op-amp crossover circuit, and I thought it sounded really brilliant, actually. I don't know to this because I didn't have measurement equipment, so I was really doing it by ear. But the thing was that it had an auxiliary output, so you could plug the bass in and go full band, or you could switch it out, and then the little speaker was full range. Anyway, I thought it was a valid project and product, and seriously started to think about going into production on my own, and even bought the parts to make 20 of these loudspeakers, 10 pairs, just the top box, I have to say, not the big bit. And at just about that time, so was it 83, I happened to see an advert for Bowers Wilkins in the Institute of Electrical Engineers monthly periodical. And it was funny because I thought, wow, B&W, I'm not worthy. And it was my father who said, pretty well, write that application letter, and if you don't, I will. Anyway, so I got the interview.
Who interviewed you there? Do you remember?
Glyn Adams, Dr. Glyn Adams, who sadly isn't with us anymore. But the thing that swung it as Glyn told me afterwards, apart from the fact I cut my hair, which was quite radical for me, the thing that really swung it was that I'd worked on active loudspeakers, and that was exactly what John Bowers was thinking they needed to do. So yeah, that was a really useful first step.
So you were hired at B&W?
Yes.
In what capacity?
Well, as an electronic engineer, because of course my degree was in electronics, they wanted somebody to create active loudspeakers, and obviously the speaker part of it was easy for them. It was the amplifier part which they really wanted help with. So it was quite natural, in fact, that I started.
Did you have an initial project?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. They more or less knew what they wanted to do. It was a product called the DM1400, two 6.5-inch Beckstream bass units and a tweeter. It's what was referred to as a 2.5-way system. So the bottom unit only went up to like 100 hertz or so, and the top up to the 3 kilohertz crossover point. But yeah, and at that time they were going to use quad 405 amplifier modules, but they'd been in discussion with a Swiss chap who was creating a new circuit for them, which was a MOSFET transistor circuit. His version was quite complex. It was on a large board, but you could tell that it had something about it which was definitely worth pursuing. So I then spent some time reconfiguring it and making some tweaks, and by the end we'd made it compact enough, and the sound was certainly worthy, and it became a product. It became the Active One. It was moderately successful, I believe, but from that point B&W decided that the amplifier module on its own was good enough to become a standalone product. So that was the first dalliance B&W had with making electronics. They had an uneasy relationship with electronics, it has to be said.
My second speakers were B&W Matrix 1s. You had something to do with that.
Yeah, right. Well, okay. I was employed as an electronic engineer, but really I was much more interested in what the speaker people were doing. If you remember, the Celestion issued the SL600. Excuse me if I get my... No, it was the SL6, wasn't it?
SL6,
the very first.
Yep.
And then they released the SL600,
yep.
which used Aerolam,
yep.
For the cabinet material. Now, it coincided. I think, again,
this was about what year? 84, 85?
So I was going to go for 80. Actually, you're right. Actually, the Celestion might well have been 85 or thereabouts. I would have said 86, actually. But anyway, around that sort of time.
Yeah.
And B&W themselves had been experimenting with cabinet materials. They had used fibercrete for the 801 head, which was a mixture of glass fibre and concrete. And they were doing other work on rubber-loaded concretes and other exotic materials. And then suddenly Celestion came along with this Aerolam, and it was like, why didn't we think of this? It's always the same when a competitor comes up with a good idea. And
wasn't Aerolam a military material?
Aerospace. It's a aluminium honeycomb sandwich. To me, the whole idea of making stiff panels to contain the pressure of the air, when surely if you were to take the reinforcement from between the skins of the composite and actually expand that core to fill the box, then the bracing of the core is between the opposite faces, where the forces are in opposition. So it struck me as being the right approach. Now, so my first proposal was that we contact Ciba Geigy and investigate the possibility of getting perforated aluminium honeycomb core and putting it between the faces of the aluminium box. The only problem about that is it's great in one direction, but the other two it's perhaps compromised. And then I don't remember the exact chronology, but this is one of those things that people say, oh, it's some marketing myth, but it's actually true. I was sitting in the tea room and there was a wine box, and I was looking at this wine box thinking, they've got card, 3 by 2 pieces of card with, interlocking cuts. And I thought, if we were to make that out of plywood and put holes in the sheets and stick it inside the box, then it would be stiff along the plane of the plywood sheets in each of the 3 orthogonal directions. I suggested it to the person who was actually studying the cabinet materials, who said, "Oof, no, it's never going to work." So I thought, well, I better try it. And I got an old, that would have been a DM12 box, made a plywood structure. We didn't have a name at that point. Lattice, I think it started off as. Glued it into the box, and it was just immediately obvious when you did the old tap test with your knuckles, this thing is stiff. This is going to work. And we put a speaker in, and sure enough, it totally worked. And that was the beginning of the Matrix series, and the Matrix 1 or 2 that you refer to was the first product to be based on that, although they went on to use it throughout most of their range, as far as I know.
When you look at the Matrix, it seems obvious. When I first saw it, I said, that seems like an obvious thing to do, and it wasn't back then?
Well, you know, it's one of those things. Everybody was bracing their speaker cabinets. It was funny how, well, as an amateur, speaker designs, magazine speaker designs would talk about sticking pieces of wood across the panels. How rare it was that people actually suggested putting the wood from one side to the other. Now, again, I don't blow my own trumpet, but in my early chipboard box designs, I was always putting bits of wood from one side to the other, because again, it's just intuitive that, you know, you're trying to stiffen these 2 opposing panels, just reinforce it. So really, yeah, the Matrix was just a logical conclusion of that. But yeah, it's remarkable how few people were actually doing that in production. It's not to say that people hadn't, yeah, people probably had talked about it, and you know, and sometimes you get a piece of wood. I'll tell you what. So imagine this is a cross-section, plan view of the cross-section of a cabinet. People would get a piece of wood and then cut out 2 oval holes and then bond it in. But you think, well, why not just cut out 4 circular holes so you've got reinforcement in both directions, something like that. Anyway, funny that people were sort of tickling the idea, but to just go all out and just intensively brace it, no, nobody had done that. Strange.
And Matrix is still in use today.
I believe so, yeah.
Anything else like that at B&W? Like a technology that you came up with?
I mean,
when did the taper tube come in?
Right, well, this is the point. It was at around that stage that John Bowers then turned to me and said, "Well, that was quite a good idea. Have you got any others?" And I just, yeah, I mean, plenty. He said, "Oh, right. Well, I've been working on," and then he brought out some prototypes and introduced me to this line of work that he'd been looking at. But unfortunately, as the owner of the company, his time was so utterly taken up with ambassadorial duties that he just really lost any possibility of finding the time to do what he really enjoyed, and that was messing around with loudspeakers. So I was very flattered and honoured that he should pass these things on to me, but it was clear that he was never going to have the time to look at them again. Anyway, so his thing was the first really significant B&W loudspeaker was the DM70, which had this electrostatic head. And when they moved to the 801, which was, you know, in its time a remarkable 3-way loudspeaker with a little tweeter on the top and then a mid-range and then the bass in a separate room, John always felt that there was just a little something missing in the ultimate transparency, liquidity, as he used to put it, of the mid and high frequencies. Something about the electrostatic that the moving coil just never quite matched. And so he had started a program of work. For him, his first line of approach had been looking at the polar pattern, the dispersion of the speaker, and he thought it was something to do with the dipolar characteristic. So he'd started experiments with what's known as a Braumoehlen-Weber baffle. Now, it's a resistive baffle, so basically what you do is you hang layers of fabric across a wooden frame, and then the loudspeakers are in the middle of that wooden frame. And the idea is the effect is that the baffle is bigger at low frequencies, which is, you know, is what we're trying to do. And it sort of smooths the edge of the baffle, but it didn't really work, to be absolutely frank. And look, to cut a long story short, by the time we'd succeeded in softening the edge of the baffle to the point where it was no longer an issue, it became quite clear that the next weak link was the cone itself. Now, at that time we were using Kevlar cones, but because they were the workhorse of the BMW at the time. And what we found was that if you put a paper cone, it sounded like paper. If you put a Bextrine cone, it sounded like Bextrine. The point was that you were hearing the cone. And I just thought, well, the obvious thing then is to find a piston which no longer has a sonic signature, which is in the audio band, i.e. you put all its resonances and breakup out of band. And we just started using aluminium domes for the high frequencies, and they had a breakup frequency which was comfortably up at 27, 28 kilohertz. That was a 26 millimeter diaphragm. So I thought, well, if we find a 50 millimeter diaphragm, it'll come into about half that, so 13 kilohertz, but we'll cross over, so it should be safe. So I searched around, scavenged actually a 50 millimeter dome from another competitor, in fact, and did some work. And again, I'll have to cut a very long story short, but eventually it turned out that the way to load the back of that driver was to put it on the end of a long tube, at which point, indeed, we had a driver that was really free of resonances and reflections.
Was this where your tapered tube came in?
At that stage, it was still just a parallel-sided tube, but the taper tube came in because we needed to, obviously, if we were having a multi-way system, we had to have an LF section, and if you imagine
a low-frequency LF.
Yeah, if you imagine a 12-inch driver in a parallel-sided tube, and my sums indicated that it should be about 3 meters long, that becomes quite a substantial volume of enclosure. It wouldn't have been straight in practice. We could have coiled it up, but it's quite a large volume. And so I kind of figured, well, above its cutoff frequency, an exponential horn behaves as a parallel-sided tube above the cutoff frequency. So if we were to put the bass driver in the end of an appropriate exponential tube with a cutoff frequency of, let's say, 20 hertz, and then have a thin parallel-sided absorber tube, that would take up a lot less space. So I did some scale model experiments. I often resort to scale models for convenience. And so I did that experiment, and it kind of worked, yes. But then just out of interest, I thought, well, what would happen if I put the fibre absorber in the actual exponential tube? And so I put a loop of wire around a few lengths of wool, dragged it into the tube such that it was really tightly packed at the thin end. And when we tested that, it ticked all the boxes. It really was close to an ideal enclosure. That, of course, was scalable to the bass, but really it worked better than the parallel-sided tube at all frequency ranges. And so that became the core technology of the speaker, which would eventually become the Nautilus.
And the Nautilus was really a landmark speaker. And you designed it entirely? How did the project come to be? How did it start that something like that got created?
I really had been, I would call it playing, exploring the field. And then we were coming up to our 25th anniversary. So yes, BMW founded in 66, so 91, 25th anniversary, and my boss, Robert Truntz.
John Bowers had died by then?
John Bowers sadly had passed away in 89. Robert said, look, in all this, actually, of course, this would be sometime before 91, probably in the middle of 1990. In all that experimentation you've been doing, have you been able to, can you see your way through to producing a single product which actually uses this technology? Because we're coming up to this anniversary. It'd be nice to show people that we've not been resting on our laurels and we have actually got something to show for it. So that was the beginning, really. So, right, what am I going to do with these various things? And the Nautilus really distilled out of that pretty quickly. So by the time of the summer of 91, when we were celebrating that 25th anniversary, we had the first wooden prototype of the Nautilus.
Did you name it the Nautilus?
I did, yeah. I mean, really, it's we started off. I don't know if you know the Magic Roundabout, which was actually a French-made kids' TV thing. But there was this character called Brian, who was a snail, and we seriously thought about calling it Brian. I mean, in retrospect,
Because it looks like a racing snail.
a racing snail, yeah. Brian the snail had an excellent sense of humour, so actually, in many ways, I would have been proud to call it so. Anyway, so the Nautilus, of course, isn't. It has this spiral shell thing. It's not an immediately obvious visual parallel, but anyway, as a name, it certainly works. The only problem with Nautilus is people say, "What's it got to do with the sea?"
True.
Well,
It's true.
I live in Brighton.
It's true. And that was a real departure for B&W. Not only the shape and whatnot, but it used all aluminum drivers.
Yes, absolutely. I've got this little, and there are a few bees in my bonnet, but I call it the consistency of philosophy, where basically if you use aluminium drivers for the mid-range, then you should probably use it for the tweeter and the bass unit as well. You can hear when you change from one sort of thing to another. It's the same actually with the loading. If you go from a closed box for the bass to dipole for the mid-range and a little bullet horn tweeter, then I think it will sound disjointed.
Discontinuities between the frequency ranges.
So even if you do decide you want to go for a horn at the top, then you should go for a low compression horn for the upper mid-range and a no compression horn for low mid, and then a closed box for the bass, something like that. So an even transition, gentle transitions.
Now, you left B&W in what year?
So I left B&W in '97. Basically, after the Nautilus, I wanted to move sideways into professional audio, and at the time, Robert Truntz was very much behind that idea, because B&W had already got their particularly 800 series monitors into recording studios around the world. But also Robert he had a record label, B&W Music, and so to him the idea of having B&W loudspeakers at every stage of the listening chain, including the live performance, seemed to make complete sense. So I actually started some pieces of work which would follow me to my years after B&W, with horns and compression drivers. I enjoyed it very much, and I particularly enjoyed a phase during the 90s where we used stacks and stacks of B&W drivers in cardboard tubes to build sound systems for illegal raves, which was a phenomenon of the time.
So, Vivid Audio began in 2004?
Right.
As a partnership between you in England and Philip Guttentag in South Africa.
Yeah, I'll just fill a little space there. So I left in '97 with the intention of making professional studio monitors. So for a couple of years, I was just working on my own, just developing drivers, because the original Nautilus drivers were a little bit low on sensitivity and power handling. So I devoted that time to using finite element analysis to develop more powerful magnets and to improve the structural performance of the diaphragms and such like. And then I was introduced to Philip in the year 2000, actually, originally, by Robert Truntz, who by then was living in South Africa. Now, Philip and a partner of his, Bruce, were interested in starting a loudspeaker manufacturing company using OEM drivers. Robert introduced me to them in the intention that perhaps I would do some consultancy work for them. But we got on very well. And immediately we started talking about how to move the project forward. And I said, I've just happened to have some drivers that I've designed, and manufacturing drivers, if you're going to make loudspeakers, you really need to manufacture the drivers as well, because anyone can put, say, us drivers in a box. They were pretty nervous about it at first. I said, no, it's just a question of the right jigs and the right glue. Really, it's quite straightforward. But it's one of those things where if we'd known then what we know now, would we have ever embarked upon it? Because actually, of course, making your own drivers is quite tricky. And yes, you do have to get the right jigs and the right glue, but it's not immediately obvious.
Is Vivid Audio really an extension of your previous work?
Absolutely. I'd already started to consider a project which would eventually become the B1, our first loudspeaker, back at B&W. We did a thing called the reaction cancelling subwoofer, and at the time I said, well, if we've got a reaction cancelling subwoofer, the next thing to do is to put a mid and a tweeter, and that was I had, you know, when I met Philip and Bruce, I had drawings of this thing. It was they who said, trouble is that's active, we can't really go into business as a young company making radical products with an active only product. So at that point the cabinet grew and we put a port in it and became a more accessible product.
Now the B1 was your first Vivid loudspeaker, and it was the first Vivid loudspeaker I had experience with. I think somebody's first idea, just like sometimes the first take, is often not the best, but there was inspiration behind it. Did you see that as the ideal loudspeaker at the time?
At the time, I'm sure I did. That was before I began to think seriously about this business of dealing with the internal cabinet resonances, which would eventually lead to the gear. But the point was that, at the time, I thought it was pretty close to ideal, yes.
So what do you think are the biggest challenges? You've done the gear range, which deals with all those internal cabinet resonances. What do you think, what do you focus on most as a loudspeaker designer? What do you think are the things that need to be overcome and maybe that others aren't addressing?
Okay, coloration is the big thing for me. And when I describe the engineering inside a Vivid Audio product, it's all about minimizing resonances and reflections. That's my little mantra. Because those are the things that our ears latch onto. Now, there are quite a few driver manufacturers out there who produce very respectable drivers that indeed give a resonance-free performance. And there are quite a few people that have cottoned on to making curvy cabinets. It's putting it all together and making sure that you know, it's only as good as the weakest link. And sometimes I think people put a whole bunch of good components into a system, but there are still weak links which betray the quality of the rest of the thing. I think that, you know, hopefully at Vivid Audio we get a good balance of dealing with all the various sources of possible coloration to give us a result which is really quite free of all that stuff.
Now, I know you've told me before that one of your things at Vivid Audio and forming the partnership is you would never compromise engineering of a loudspeaker for other things. In other words, it's the performance, it's the product, it has to be a certain way. Can you explain that?
The obvious thing is the number of people who've said, couldn't we put our drivers into a square wooden box? Well, of course we could, but that would be a massive compromise and I would never do that, even though there are whole cohorts of people who think that our funny-shaped cabinets don't look right and that they are wedded to the idea of a square wooden box because that's the way a loudspeaker should look. Well, I would never make that compromise.
Have you ever been tempted or just no?
Just no. No, really, it would be a definite backward step. Having said that, look, we still make square wooden boxes for prototypes, but, well, here's the thing. We've made a square wooden box equivalent of our K45, and we use it to show how much worse a square wooden box sounds when compared with a curvy composite box. We can actually put the two side by side and see they are.
I've heard people say a Vivid Audio speaker, it's an artistic design. It's an artistic choice. It's not?
No, we're an engineering-led company. When I do my little presentations at hi-fi shows, it's almost the first thing I say, because indeed, so many people get that wrong. I think gradually people are learning, but the number of times in the past we heard people say, oh yes, Vivid Audio, an interesting exercise in design, but clearly not serious serious engineering. Well, it's absolutely the other way.
Yeah, I was going to say, what would you say to that? What would you say? What would be your first reaction to that person who says that?
I come at it as an engineer, but I've always considered design to be a very important part of a product, especially something as sculptural, well, as significantly large as a loudspeaker. Inevitably, the design is going to become an important aspect. Now, of course, I understand that design is also a matter of personal taste, and I quite happily acknowledge that my idea of good design is going to be different to somebody else's. No, that I admit. But so many of the aspects of the look of a Vivid audio loudspeaker are there for functional reasons, and that's the most important thing.
So at Vivid, in terms of engineering, you have pretty much free reign to create the speakers you want?
Absolutely, yes.
Do you know that, I talk to a lot of loudspeaker designers. Do you know that many are envious of your position to do that? Do you realize that?
Break free. Look, there's a price to be paid.
Which is?
Finance. I mean, when I look at how well appointed other people's R&D departments are, it makes me feel, a little bit envious. But what price? Free will, as it were. It's no, it's great. It's great fun. And okay, it's taken a while to reach the stage that we are at today. And maybe if we'd had a huge cash injection, we could have got here quicker. But it's been a great journey. I'm very pleased with the way that things have progressed and evolved, and I think that we've reached this point, some would say organically, but it's a really good foundation. It feels really solid, and I feel ready to go off in new directions. And I think the brand is strong, and we have a good loyal following. So
the Matrix, the tapered tubes, the Vivid speakers, a lot of them have a longevity. Like the Gia G1 started when?
2008 we actually officially launched it.
So it's coming on a 13-year-old design, but it's still in production.
It is, yeah.
Do you see yourself, I know many people do, see you as a forward-thinking person? Do you see yourself as a forward-thinking person, a person ahead of their time on certain things?
I certainly think of myself as being forward-thinking. While at BMW, inevitably, lots of ideas were floated around, and it's great to see some of these things coming up, other manufacturers putting them together, and you kick yourself and think, I wish I'd actually got that together and done it. But nevertheless, it feels justified. You think, that's glad that idea has seen the light of day. But you can't do it all.
Yeah, do you still have some ideas for the future that aren't there yet?
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
And how about, do you know who Livio Cucuzza is?
Yes.
Did you know that he wrote that your Nautilus inspired him to get into audio? What do you think when you hear something like that?
It just brings a warm glow. I'm touched. No, really, and because I've met Livio since, and he's a lovely bloke. So now I'm very proud to have inspired someone like that. I'm proud to inspire anybody, really, obviously.
And so, what would you say to somebody? Let's say somebody wants to start up a loudspeaker company, and you want to give them good advice. In other words, not from necessarily a financial point of view, but from a piece of advice that would say, if they made a career out of audio, how should they approach it to give them the most satisfaction?
I think it's really important to actually have a good understanding of the engineering that on which it's all based. It's all too easy to buy those OEM drivers and stick them in a wooden box, but to really advance the art, you do have to understand the engineering principles behind it, and there are far too many people in this business who don't really have that. Having said all that, of course, you can use design to your advantage. As I've said, loudspeakers are a sculptural object, and so of course you can make beautiful looking loudspeakers that perhaps are not that innovative in an engineering standpoint, and you can create a brand that way and then bring in the engineering expertise to move it forward. But
from an engineer's point of view?
From an engineer's point of view, I would say jolly well knuckle down and learn that stuff. Kinsler and Frey, Baranek, you know, the work of Olson, all this stuff, the fundamentals of acoustics. It's pretty important.
And if somebody in the future remembers you as a loudspeaker designer, what would you say you'd want to be remembered as?
Which of my...
What would you want them to think of you?
Somebody who didn't just repeat what had gone on before, but thought, now why do we do this? And how can we make it better?
Thank you, Laurence.
Pleasure.